wherever you're joining us from. My name's Caroline Sanderson and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. Now, with reading being the ideal lockdown activity, there's been a lot of discussion of late about what constitutes the perfect kind of comfort reading we might turn to at this time. I don't think you can do much better than a page-turning novel with an enthralling plot and entertaining characters who keep you guessing, by an author you can absolutely trust. Such an author for me is renowned best-selling novelist Joanna Trollope. But in describing her novels as comfort reading, I don't mean to suggest they are too comfortable. For I believe Joanna is one of the most astute chroniclers we have of modern family life, with all its trials and tribulations. So I'm absolutely delighted that Joanna, born of course here in the Stroud Valleys, has agreed to talk to us at Stroud Book Festival today. She'll be discussing her latest novel, Mum and Dad, with publisher Louisa Joyner. I just want to say thank you so much to Waitrose Stroud for sponsoring this event and to Louisa Joyner for chairing. And so I'm going to now hand over to you, Louisa.
Mum and Dad is the most exquisite novel. I was sharing some of the praise about the brilliant and technical sort of lightness of Joanna's writing, and she was saying that one of the things she really wanted from Mum and Dad, and something I think it succeeds in spades, is that it deals with lots of complicated and interesting issues, but in such a light way. And absolutely.
Yes,
and
because I mean, everybody now is wondering what they do about their own parents.
Absolutely. And in a minute, we'd love to have a reading, but I just want to check everyone heard the fabulous story, because I was saying, let's talk about the title. And you were saying it wasn't actually the title.
No, I called it The Sandwich Generation. That was its working title. And it was my agent, Jim, who came up with the title of Mum and Dad, because everybody's got a mum and dad. I mean, everybody knows, well, their mothers. They wouldn't be here without their mothers.
It's so clever, though, because something you do in the novel is everybody tries to parent, including the children.
Oh, they do. They do. Mm.
And are you interested in that when you're that point? I mean, that sandwich point when you start to have to parent your parents?
Very much so. Oh, yes. I mean, I think it's one of the, my only aim with these novels is to get the conversation going, to start the conversation. I mean, it's much easier to say, have you read Mum and Dad, than to say, what are we going to do about your old parents and our teenage child who is in a great state of distress? You know, it's much easier to say, have you read a novel? It kind of gets it going, gets the subject going.
Absolutely. And I was reading somewhere you talking about something that I think is very special about books in general, which is that sort of radical intimacy. You get to go somewhere and sort of feel around.
Well, I think it's something to do with a physical book. You know, with a physical book, you can kind of confess all kinds of things to it that you can't do. I know if you're reading a Kindle on public transport, nobody can tell if you're reading 50 Shades of Grey or War and Peace. You know, they have no idea. But on the other hand, there is something you can kind of let yourself go behind a physical book. You know, you can somehow use it as a confessional. You can just say, you know, I felt like this.
Mm. And I think particularly novels, I think non-fiction can be wonderful, but it's a you have to know someone really well to give them Philippa Perry's The Book You Wish Your Parents Had Read.
Yes, exactly.
Which is a phenomenal work. But novels have a sort of generosity that's the subtlety of not looking at something directly, perhaps.
Well, I think you can say to a novel, you can kind of confess to a novel. You can say, I felt like that. You know, when I lost my job, when I got dumped, whatever it was, you can kind of admit it, and you wouldn't admit it to anybody in real life ever.
I think few people, Joanna, they were able to recreate those moments with this sort of surgical precision that you do. I mean, there's a moment in this book where I sort of blushed because I felt like you'd overheard a conversation with my mum, you know, where you think.
Well, yes, but you know, that's the point really, because you know, if you lose your job, or you get dumped, or whatever it is, or you have a baby for the first time, it might be happening every nanosecond out in the world, but the first time it's happening to you, it's the first time in the history of the world, and that's got to be acknowledged. So your reaction of, oh God, I can't bear that, it's far too close to the bone, is brilliant. That's perfect.
Well, it's very, very, I know editorially it's very hard to do, and you do it with such grace. Would you read for us, Joanna? Would you?
Yes, I'd love to.
Great.
Now, I'm going to read a passage about the central dilemma, which is really what to do with your old parents. And Gus and Monica, who are the old parents, they moved to Spain in the early 1990s. And then the then Prime Minister of Spain, who was a man from Seville, was he really just sort of flung open Spain's doors to everybody, and a huge number of people from England went to Spain. Not just the Costa del Crime lot, but also, you could have you could buy an enormous property. You could have, the weather was gorgeous, the cost of living was half, and so Gus moves to Spain in about 1992, and Monica, being an old-fashioned wife, follows the drum and goes with him, and they start a vineyard. He starts a vineyard in southern Spain, in a place which imitates really the climatic conditions of Rioja. And then Gus, the novel opens, so it's not a spoiler in any way. Gus has a stroke. And he's always said there's a perfectly good hospital in Ronda, and he's going to go there. He doesn't want to go back. He doesn't want to go to England and be looked after by the NHS. He wants to stay in Spain. And Gus and Monica have got 3 grown-up children who all live in London with their own families. And they, of course, when Gus has his stroke, they've all got to go out from London to Spain. And this is a conversation that Katie, who is she's a very high-flying libel lawyer. She's really the breadwinner in her family. She has the conversation in the hotel, in the hospital cafeteria with her older brother. And this is after she's seen her father just once, and so has Sebastian, her older brother, and they are horrified by all of it. I mean, not least because, a stroke is a wretched thing to have. It's a sort of life sentence. It's a character changer. And so this is Katie and Sebastian in the hospital cafeteria in Ronda. I've got friends, Katie said, who've been dealing with parent crises forever. Disabled parents, sick parents, demented parents, alcoholic parents, just generally hopeless parents. And I've sympathised with them. I've made all the right noises. I've done all the supportive things like, I've had their children to stay. I've made casseroles. I've generally done my bit. But while I was doing it, I suppose I was thinking all the time that because Mum and Dad had made this very distinct and different decision to move to Spain, that they'd made themselves remote from all the usual responsibilities of family, and that we were somehow free of the consequences of their choices. But we aren't, are we? this happens out of the blue. And suddenly we're landed with our parents and they're kind of infantilized, aren't they? And they're looking to us like fledglings. It's awful, Sebastian, awful. And I feel extra awful that I didn't see it coming, that I pretty much chose not to see it coming. I mean, last night, I wondered if I should go into Mum's room to see if she was okay, and I didn't. I decided not to, because if I'm honest, I didn't want to. I didn't make myself. But Mum's seen Dad. She must know the score. She must know it's very unlikely he'll recover enough to be able to run the vineyard, and that must scare her. I mean, what's the future for her? And for Dad, what's Dad thinking? It's beyond awful for them. It really is. Here they are in the ruins of what once looked like a bold and adventurous dream. No wonder they're frightened. As frightened as we are.
That was gorgeous. And I think really crystallises this dilemma at the novel's heart about this sandwiching between sort of love and affection, and also the need to still be a child. And something the book's fantastic about is the relationship between those three siblings, one getting to stay with his parents and the others going.
You know, the extraordinary thing is, even though the siblings are grown up, the old rivalries they had when they were children are still alive and well. They all are. And then Katie's child begins on a particularly ghastly modern problem, and she doesn't know what to do about it. She wonders if, because she's working and she's the breadwinner in the family, she's wondering if that's why, you know, she wasn't paying attention. Well, of course it's not that, but you know, there is something in it.
And I think there's, as a working mother, the generosity in the writing for you not making that, you know, for you letting everybody off the hook. You have this wonderful ability to not ascribe blame, to let people talk about what upsets them.
Well, you can't blame anybody. I mean, it's just evolving. We are living at an extraordinary time when the relationship between the genders is being readjusted. I mean, if it started, I suppose it started when my late mother was born, about 1918. And it's amazing how far we've got. But actually, in terms of you know, gender equality or women's liberation, if you like. But, you know, I really feel that my oldest granddaughter is 22, and if her grandchildren see any kind of real change, that'll be quite early. It'll be quite soon, quite rapid.
Yeah, there's still quite a lot to do, isn't there? And I think one thing I wanted to pick up on, because you use it very cleverly, is the two locations, is Spain, both as I love at a time when none of us can go anywhere, to spend a little bit of time in the world.
I know.
I thought it was lovely. I didn't have to worry about burns, but I had such a nice time.
Oh, awful.
But was that something very deliberate? Did you want to use, because you explore space and how these people are trapped in a sort of not quite one foot or the other? Was that something you were interested in?
Very, very, very interested. I flew to Gibraltar to research it, because you have to see, I have to go somewhere, and I have to see sort of what grows there, you know, what birds are flying there, what the atmosphere's like. You've got to understand it. And I do very, very serious research for all these novels, because I think, you know, somewhere out there's a reader who knows about, well, Spain in this case, much better than I do. But, you know, you can't have them thinking, I'm not going to, because, you know, this woman has got Spain wrong, I'm not going to believe another word she says.
I think your integrity for the reader is extraordinary and exquisite, but there's also, of course, the Spanish family. There's Pilar, and
there is, quite
the
different.
sort of adoptive daughter, if you like. Were you interested in those the daughters-in-law and the sort of adoptive daughters?
Very much so. Yes, because there's two daughters-in-law, very different, and they don't really get on. I mean, everybody except Gus, possibly, the old boy, everybody makes a journey in this book. I mean, even Gus makes a sort of journey. Yes, he does. But everybody ends this book, or they end it in a different place than the one where they started.
Both physically and emotionally.
Very much so.
Absolutely.
Very much so.
And it's placed a big part when you set about writing. It's placed at the beginning of the work. This is leading naturally to some questions people have about your Gloucestershire-based potential for work.
Well, yes, exactly. I've always remembered a journalist once described me as mistakenly as the mistress of the cliche. A cliche is only a cliche if it's happening in someone else's life. If it's happening in your life, it's the first time in the history of the world that anybody's had a baby or done anything of that kind. You know, it's so patronizing. But I've lived in London for 20 years. I mean, you know, luckily the tabloid press hasn't caught up with the fact that I've moved. And I did live in Gloucestershire for years and years. And I was born there. And I was born, you know, there at the end of the last war. So I think, you know, that it, again, it's the sort of tabloid desire to diminish women, you know, to talk about your weight and your shoes and your eye makeup and your relationships always, which they'd never do to men, would they? Any of them.
It is I refuse to use the category women's fiction because there is no male corollary. So I just think until we have men's, you know, it's the idea that one section of society gets to be people while the rest of us are defined.
I know. But, you know, for my generation of men, a lot of men will say to me, of course, I never read novels. And it's sort of said as a proud boast. You know, it's the sort of, I had an email yesterday from a woman who, my sort of age, you know, in her late 70s. And she said, you know, her husband is adamant that he won't read anything about relationships. Can't bear it. And, you know, you just know that, you know, that's what's the trouble with him, really.
I find it's great to do it by stealth. You know, introduce people to books that, you know, rave about them, get them hooked, and then they discover that they might like to read novels. I think
exactly.
I think
younger men and gay men read all my books. You know, they're not afraid of their feelings.
You took the words out of my mouth. It feels like we're heading in a slightly some of those presumptions about writing, and I think also we're seeing in lockdown as well, and through this period that we're all stuck at home, we're trying different avenues to entertain ourselves, and I think that's meaning really exciting things for the way we read.
It is, and new ways of thinking. And really, I'm reading. Do you remember James Rebanks? You remember The Shepherd's Life?
I do, The Shepherd's Life.
He's written a new one called English Pastoral, which is really about farming and the future of farming. But he's saying, you know, the old ways weren't always wrong. And some things will grow and some animals will be very, very successful in various parts of the world. And, you know, it's trial and error that's worked this out.
How interesting. We've got a lovely question that rather ties in with that sense of of resilience and things finding a way to survive. And it's from Amanda. And she says, family dynamics are hard for all of us to navigate.
Oh, they are. Mm.
And not getting easier with having to do it all on Skype and things. That's my addition, not Amanda's. My dad always says, never make ultimatums in case the outcomes don't go your way. And my mum always says, be kind. Do you have any rules you try to live your life by?
Oh, Amanda, thank you so much for this. I suppose it's really trying to put myself in other people's shoes. You know, that even if I see where they're coming from, I mean, in Jake, in this novel, I understood where he came from. I understood how he got to being where he was. And even though he himself is a deeply flawed character, I really understood him. So I think that's true of my attitude to life, really, generally. That I just try and see why people why they paint themselves into corners.
Which takes incredible emotional generosity. As a writer, Joanna, how do you do that? I remember a story, for example, from one South African author about the fact he dreaded dinner parties with another South African author because he'd get you drunk and then he'd steal stories from your life and you'd pop up in his novel with something you hadn't meant to divulge.
Well, that's why I don't talk about sort of work in progress very much. And I remember being told a story when John Mortimer was still married to Penelope Mortimer, and a guest at their lunch table told a wonderful story, and they both leapt to their feet and were determined to go off and write it down. But I think it's I don't, that there isn't a truth in this world that isn't common to all of us. And it's ludicrous to sort of pretend that we are somehow, the only mouthpiece for it. Everything's in common with all of us, which is maybe one of the things we are discovering inadvertently during this pandemic.
That's very interesting. Go on. You think in terms of how we're all living in a much more sort of common, our day-to-day lives have become perhaps more.
Well, the thing is that we are human beings, and we've got, I suppose it's sort of Stone Age brains, haven't we? And we need to be loved. We need each other's approval. Some of us need to reproduce ourselves, whatever it is. Not everybody, and we should remember those who don't, particularly women, who are very quick to make judgments, aren't they, about each other, based, I think, on the choices that women have made themselves for their own lives, or at least maybe they're not choices, maybe they're something that that they were compelled to. And I think that the times we are born in are terrifically important and influential. I mean, Monica in this book is very much of her generation. I mean, she's a tiny bit younger than me, but she was brought up to believe that your husband came first. Well, excuse me, he doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think we should, in a moment, it would be lovely to get that second reading. But the thing I just wanted to touch on before we moved into that you talk about that is true for Monica. It's true for actually all the women, is that
it is.
They also don't always know what their choices were or if they made.
No, because the moment you're born, the attitudes of your generation are terrifically influential.
Absolutely. And that leads us rather beautifully to Marta, who I think you're going to read us about, because the book's brilliant
I
on
am.
inarticulability, and this is a young woman who isn't able to articulate her sort of feelings necessarily.
She isn't. Now, Katie is the breadwinner. She's the libel lawyer, and she has got she's got 3 daughters. Daisy, who's the oldest, who's about 16, is sort of remote and contemptuous of her parents and everything. And then the middle one, Marta, is really quite complicated. I mean, she's only 13, but she's got a big, very modern problem. And this is Daisy and Katie together in the kitchen. Daisy went without hurry over to the kettle and carried it to the sink. With her back to her mother and the tap running, she said, "Actually," and then she stopped. "Actually what?" Katie said. Daisy carried the full kettle back to its base and switched it on. "Maybe now," she said, "isn't such a good time." "For what?" "To talk to you," Daisy said. "To talk to me about what? About you going out on a Sunday night?" Daisy waited. She got a mug out of one cupboard and a tea bag out of a Kilner jar in another and dropped one into the other. And then, with her back still turned to her mother, she said, "Marta." Katie was taken aback. "Marta," she said. "You mean her not eating? The constant saying she isn't hungry when her school bag and her wastepaper basket are full of chocolate wrappers?" "No," Daisy said. "Not that. Her not eating is to stop you seeing what's really the matter." Katie stared at her. "What?" "I feel awful telling you," Daisy said. "Marta doesn't know I'm saying anything. In fact, I don't think she knows I know. She just thinks she and her friends who are doing it have got some little exciting secret or something." Katie felt for a chair and sat down in it. "Doing what?" she said. Daisy busied herself with making her mother's tea. "Doing what, Daisy?" Katie said again. "Drugs. Is it drugs?" Daisy carried Katie's mug over to the table and set it down. "Not drugs," Daisy said. She went to the fridge and extracted a litre carton of milk from the door. Then she turned back and set the milk down by Katie's elbow. "Not drugs," she said again. "Cutting." Katie gasped. "Cutting?" "Haven't you noticed?" Daisy said. "She's always got long sleeves on." "But, Mum," Daisy said, "don't say why. Parents always say why." "They say it," Katie said, "because it's important. Of course it is. Why? Why is Marta cutting herself, if of course she is?" Daisy was nodding. "Oh, she is. She's been doing it for weeks." "Weeks," Katie said. "Mum, she's careful." "Of course she is. It's part of it not being caught." "Part of it? Part of what?" Daisy sighed. "Part of the relief." "Relief?" "They do it because they can't stand stuff. So there's relief for a little bit after they've done it. And then it all builds up again and they need more relief." Katie put out a hand and gripped Daisy's arm. "Daisy, does Dad know?" Daisy moved her arm out of Katie's grip and massaged it. "Of course not," she said. "Only you. Honestly, you ask the weirdest things." So this self-harming thing is very common nowadays.
And so It's interesting because you use the word modern and nowadays here. It's something clearly that's a prevailing concern. Is it something you very much wanted to write about?
I did want to, because it is a form of self-expression for frantic teenagers. Because teenagers were only invented as a word when I was about, I suppose, I was practically 20. I think it was the late 60s, really, wasn't it, that it was invented. Before that, you were either a child or you were longing to be grown up. You weren't one or the other. And now I think there is a great understanding of how complicated it is to be no longer a child, to be between 11 and 20. It's just misery for them because they have completely different brains. They have a completely different attitude. They don't think they're ever going to die, which is why they dice with death. And it's very, very complex for them, and they're hormonally an absolute mess, I think. And I think this pent-up feeling of you can't stand life another minute, and so you deal with you deal with yourself with the only thing you've got to hand, which is your body.
Gosh.
So the thing about abusing your body is nobody will know, nobody will see. But of course, it's a wretched condition, and it's part of this modern misery. It's part of the pent-upness of everybody, them feeling so unresolved. And they can't, a lot of them, they're self-harming because they can't explain, because there isn't the language to say how ghastly it is being them. They haven't got the language. And so they act it out instead.
Mm.
I'm really sorry for them.
Yeah, it's quite urgent. I mean, as always, you make me think the brain is fizzing because it's also insightful.
Well, that's exactly what I want everybody to do, is to talk about it. Talk about it, I would have said in the old days at work, or round the family supper table, or whatever it is. But, you've got to really discuss it.
But I think it's really interesting. Have you come across Gia Tolentino?
No.
So she wrote an incredible set of essays called Trick Mirror, and she writes brilliantly about the fact that, particularly as a teenager, quite often prior to the last sort of 15, 20 years, the advent of our social media sort of explosion, that would perform your life. So you would hang out with your friends and say the right things, and then you would come home and essentially home would be backstage.
Oh, and of course, and that feeds into social media, isn't it? Where you pretend to be fine and you're not fine at all.
And her crucial point is that there is no longer any backstage. So the coming home, being backstage and taking off your makeup and that sort of just being, so perhaps being younger if you don't quite feel as old as your peer group, or, the safety, but that has gone.
There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to hide.
So these children aren't able to take that break where they revisit a younger version.
They're always on display, aren't they?
Yeah.
And we're such a visual age now, aren't we?
It's an absolutely brilliant. The essays are fantastic. I think they're a series of podcasts.
Just tell me her name again.
Gia Tolentino.
Gia
Tolentino.
When you come off air, you can tell me what.
I will. But what I thought was particularly interesting about Mum and Dad is that Gia is fascinating, but she's very much writing to that younger generation, whereas you're also doing, I think, and it's you pull off a high wire act, which is that you do let us understand what Martha, you give us a sense of her, but it is also the parental desire to fix, and the sort of the fear of, I love the competition, the sense of competition with her husband, essentially, when she says, does Dad know? That feeling of
yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, how dare he not know?
And that's the conversation too, isn't it? It's the parents, and really interesting that it's the grandmother and granddaughter who end up finding a way to speak. Is that something that sort of just skipping the generation that?
Well, I think grandparents and grandchildren often have a better relationship. I mean, the cliche is that they've got a common enemy in, the parents. But is it really? It's not really fair, really, to say that. But I think often, you haven't got to make your grandchildren. It's not your responsibility to make your grandchildren into good citizens, whereas it is a terrific responsibility to make your children into good citizens. So you've sort of the pressure is off in a way.
Mm. And perhaps that allows you to be more honest with, I don't know if that allows a sort of honesty in those relationships. In the book, certainly, the grandchildren find it much easier to be honest with their grandparents. They speak to them more, by which I guess I mean they speak more directly.
Yes, I think for the grandchildren, there's a feeling that you can't. You're trying to protect your mother from various things, so you're not as candid with her possibly as you are, but your mother or father. But your grandmother is fine. It's different for her, and there's a kind of candor in the relationship that there really isn't. And sometimes, this insanity of not letting grandparents and grandchildren be together in lockdown, it's such a mistake. Mm-hmm. It's going to create such agonizing problems.
I think, it's a real social disconnect, isn't it?
It is, and it's a very natural thing. And I think the English we are not terribly good at this multi-generational thing. The Europeans, the Catholic, Italy and France are sort of rather better at it, and particularly Italy, where everybody lives in multi-generational households. And so that's a very, very, it's a very valuable, enriching thing to do.
To spend time intergenerationally?
Yes,
absolutely.
It is.
And actually that brings me on beautifully to another question. And if you have more, please, we'd love to hear from you. It's specifically a question about writing in lockdown, but I think it really feeds into what you're talking about, how we're all living and working, which is Jenny, who was asking how you've spent time during lockdown writing, as well as like saying if it's changing your approach to work. I suppose both to subject matter and to your daily practice.
I think, actually, Jenny, I'm so old that it's not going to change anything very much, except to emphasize, various aspects of the whole business. But I write the novels in longhand because I always have, because I grew up very much pre-screen. And there's no reason to change any of that really now. And so I don't. But I would say that the writing during the initial lockdown when was it? March, April? Yeah. I couldn't write anything because I write about real life. And this was so weird. It was an aberration from real life. And I simply couldn't write. And obviously I will include the effects of this extraordinary year because we're all behaving rather differently as a result. And I think that will, it'll just come in as a nod to in the next book, it'll be there because I am reflecting real life. But no, Jenny, I couldn't write at all because it was so peculiar. And anyway, I was cleaning the house, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. And I cleaned the house. In fact, it was quite salutary because I have a Portuguese cleaner usually for 4 hours a week. And I am amazed at what she achieves, including the ironing in 4 hours. And I was quite glad to be able to clean the house for the first sort of twice. And then I thought, the kitchen floor needs cleaning again, and I'm bored stiff by it.
But I think that sort of, that it reminded me slightly of maternity leave, of when the children were very small, like living a hyper domestic life, and I became obsessed with cleaning things because I was looking at them all the time.
Yes, of course.
I got to the point where I thought about laminating people because it would be easier to keep everything else. But I think that's very important, and I think very soothing for people to hear, because there's a lot of stuff generally in the papers about it's the perfect time to start writing and use this time, as if we'd all been granted a sabbatical.
No, it's not.
Trauma.
There's a marvellous piece in The Guardian today. Margaret Atwood, she's written about writing poetry, because she couldn't write at all. I mean, I think she's really a scientist, isn't she, by nature? And she's sort of small and fierce. But really, the poems, I think, are a brilliant thing, because they're the closest that the literary genre gets to music, don't you think?
Yes. Phraseology.
So that poetry is an instinctive halfway house for an awful lot of people. It's perfectly understandable. I remember because I'm a trustee of the National Literacy Trust, because it is, we have one of the worst levels of literacy, because we don't admire being able to read and write in this country, sadly. But I know that the masses of girls in state schools, particularly the headscarfed ones, the Muslim girls, they took to writing poetry when they were sort of 12 or 13, because it was so instant and immediate, and they needed to find an outlet for all their feelings. And this is what they did. Poetry was the answer.
I think, and beyond those sort of demographics, I mean, we noticed at Faber a huge upsurge at the beginning of lockdown in our poetry kind of sales.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah,
it is, and it actually comes full circle to something we talked about right at the beginning, and I'm not sure if we were with everybody at that point, when we were talking about the sort of the mainstream media's obsession with a certain kind of capital L literature, and actually both certain forms of poetry that young people, and particularly young boys, I've found, adore poetry because of its literally because of its brevity.
It is exactly that. And boys are not encouraged to be emotional, to be in touch with their feelings or anything. The ideal of masculinity is so streetwise and hard, and they've got to suppress their emotions, whereas privately you can write poems secretly, furtively, and just get it all out there without having to admit that you have.
And that leads me to a question that I had, because I was reading somewhere that you described your work as more social than political, but it seems to me, how do you separate those two things? Because it seems
you can't.
Deeply political. Yeah.
No, you can't. You can't really. No, I think when I say it's social, it's because I am interested in social, and with modern politicians making such a nonsense of everything at the moment, and in a way we've got to, and this is very evident, and I'm sure everybody attending the Stroud Literary Festival online will be doing this anyway. We've got to do our own thing. We've got to just obey our own instincts, haven't we?
And have permission to. And I think,
yes,
as we approach the last 10 minutes, if there's anything anybody wants to touch on that we haven't raised, I'd love to hear from you. I think, Joanna, in a few minutes, because this book brought me such joy, I would love to get a little reading from you at the end, because I think it's a fillip, and we should send people out into the world feeling, that they can face the rest of the day, whatever it contains. just before we just have that final little reading, I just also wanted to touch very briefly on sons, because we talked lots about daughters and those relationships, and sons and fathers, and you just mentioned that I was really Sebastian feels like an Austen heroine to me. Like
he is. Well, he goes on a tremendous journey, but his two sons become his allies, really. They're the ones who can deal with Gus, their old grandfather, far better than and they're almost fathering their grandfather.
But also, you write really beautifully about him being very attractive. I love the idea of him blooming. Like, were you interested in
the physical thing? Because this idea, and I think this is broadly speaking, women are probably rather better at seeing life as a journey. I know that's another cliche, but it's incredibly true. And when we have a failure, we just think, oh, well, I've learnt something from that and I won't do it again. I will try and profit from it. Whereas men see a failure, and this is a huge generalization, they see a failure as a failure of them as people. So they don't admit to it.
Gosh, that's interesting.
But it is. I just think that the whole idea of, men make life so difficult for each other. Well, I think women do in a different way. But men make life so hard for one another because of the image of masculinity.
And Sally has timed her question perfectly. She said, what's the most difficult thing about writing characters from the opposite sex?
I suppose it's back to the Italian thing. What a lovely question, Sally. It's back to the Italian thing of men fall in love with their eyes, but women through their ears on the whole, which is very, very true. Men mind terribly about appearances, and women don't at all. No. Or far less. But I think the most difficult thing about writing about men is understanding them, and so they've got to be quite grown up in themselves. That's the hardest thing. They've got to be quite mature in order to understand how they themselves, what their failures are, what their weak spots are, whatever it is.
Absolutely, that balance of self-awareness with lack of self-awareness that doesn't kick the reader out for thinking, I don't think they'd know that in themselves. They wouldn't necessarily recognise that.
No, exactly. And Sebastian does this, whereas his younger brother, Jake, doesn't really do it at all.
No, he's much too busy. We've got two more quick questions. Carrie, this is a brilliant question, I think. I mean, they've all been fantastic, but I just thought this was particularly interesting. What was an early experience where you learned that language had power?
Oh, my goodness, Carrie. Thank you so much for that. Well, I suppose quite early it would have been, because it's not at all rare for someone of my generation to have been reading fluently by the time we were 5. I mean, we all were. Because, there was no distraction around. There were no screens, nothing. So I imagine it was fairly early that I realized that language had power.
Are there any?
I think I've always told myself stories. I'm still at it in a way, although it's less now. That I've got more discipline about wanting to tell stories now. But I think earlier, when I was a child, I really did. But I think the business of the power of language has only really come on me probably the last 20 years, just realizing how strong it is. Thank you, though. What a wonderful question.
Good, wasn't it?
Well, that would do actually as an A-level question, wouldn't it?
It would, wouldn't it? Yeah. I think we should all learn that. And then a final question from Jim. If we've got time to sneak in a tiny reading, I'm not sure. But Jim asks, and this I love, as an editor, I love this question. What did you edit out of this book? Feel free to plead the fifth if you don't wish to.
No, well, this comes back to how I write. And I write on big A4 pads, and I only write on the right-hand side of the page. So I tinker with it on the left-hand side, and I nearly always take stuff out. I don't put stuff back. I mean, sometimes a sentence will seem to me to be to lack harmony. You know, it's just wrong somehow, and I can't quite work out why. But it's just it just doesn't feel right. You know, there's too much weight in it, or it's just ugly in some way or another. But I should think the editing out. I mean, when it comes to the research, I suppose I do about 3 or 4 times as much research as I actually need to put in the book. But that's just so that I know whatever I'm writing about, I know it extremely well.
That's the equivalent of scaffolding, isn't it? When you're building a building, you need it.
It is. Exactly that.
We haven't got long. I'm looking at Caroline. I'm hoping, yes, we could squeeze in. Joanna, if we could just end with you reading. You do it so beautifully. And I want to thank you for the most deeply, phenomenally enjoyable hour. Your wisdom and kindness.
I'm so glad. Well, what shall we end with Sebastian's sons?
Oh, that would be super. Yes, they're little action heroes, aren't they?
They really are. Let me just find a bit. Now, when they go to Spain and Dermot is he's the older of Sebastian's boys, and here he is talking to his mother. And he's talking to his mother, who's been really quite difficult and controlling and awkward about the whole thing, about them going to Spain, about everything. And she's called Anna, and she's quite a difficult, spiky character altogether. And here are Anna is doing VAT on her computer or something for the business that she and Sebastian run, and Dermot comes to find her. Dermot dropped into the nearest armchair. He balanced the side of one trainered foot on the knee of his other leg. I suppose he's about 17, something like that. He said shortly, "I want to talk to you about Spain." "Oh," said Anna. "Don't say it like that, Mum. Spain's great, and it's important." Anna swiveled herself round in her chair so that she could see Dermot properly. "I wasn't saying it like anything, Dermot," she said. He frowned, but not at her. "Don't pretend, Mum." "I'm not," Anna said. "Thing is," Dermot said much more loudly, "that Spain matters to us, Marcus and Dad and me, and it matters a lot to Grandpa, who's really created it. So if you want to be part of something that's really important to all of us, you'll have to change your attitude." Anna said stiffly, "There's nothing wrong with my attitude." Dermot snorted. Really? So you're fine with Granny, are you? Anna looked down at her hands. It takes two to tango, Dermot. Mark and I got on fine with her. She's lovely. A pair of handsome and enthusiastic grandsons is a very different matter from an unsuitable daughter-in-law. Dermot took his foot off his knee. Oh, he said, why are you unsuitable? I'm not conventional enough, Anna said. I'm not biddable and sweetly pretty. Dermot lifted his other foot and inspected his trainer close up. Then he said, well, he said, Dad seemed really at ease there. He was fine. Perhaps, Anna said, it's new, this confidence of his. Perhaps things are better between Granny and Dad after Grandpa's stroke. Maybe. Anna glanced at him sharply. What's that supposed to mean? Dermot lowered his foot to the floor. Nothing, he said. Dermot? Thing is, Mum, Dermot said with sudden energy, Grandpa has built something pretty amazing in Spain. And if you go on being sniffy about it, you're the one who'll lose out, because we won't change. We liked it, and if you can't like it too, then that's your loss, not ours. Okay. That's Anna Toad.
So much for such a warm and enthralling event. And Joanna, it just reminds me of how beautifully and compassionately you write about all generations. It's just marvellous. So thank you both so much. Thank you. And apologies to everybody for the technical issues that we had. I really hope that it didn't spoil your enjoyment of that wonderful event. Just a reminder that you can buy Joanna's book, which is a total treat, Mum and Dad, from Stroud Bookshop, stroudbookshop.com. We urge you to buy it from them or from your local independent bookshop at this very challenging time for independent retailers. And if you've enjoyed this event and you'd like to support Stroud Book Festival, perhaps by donating what you might have paid for a ticket today, details of how to do this are on our website, stroudbookfestival.org.uk. Coming up next at 4:00, you can see a conversation that I recorded earlier this year with the internationally renowned designer Kath Kidston at her house, her beautiful house, which is tucked away on the edge of a Stroud Valley. Find out how she went about turning it into a beautiful yet practical home. See you then.